Now, moving right on, I want to introduce to you Ben Wolfgang, who will be our moderator tonight. Mr. Wolfgang is a national reporter for the Washington Times. He covers the domestic drone industry in addition to education and energy. Lately, he's written extensively about the emergence of drones and the impact they'll have on personal privacy, as well as their many positive uses for law enforcement and sectors such as agriculture. He's also explored other often ignored topics related to drones, including how the sector will affect remote-controlled airplane pilots and the rapid growth of an entire industry devoted to anti-drone technology. I think that RC there is radio-controlled, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah. We used to have a lot of those. A lot of people used to bring their model airplanes, their radio-controlled ones, out to the picnic area at Manassas Battlefield. Ben joined the Washington Times in 2011, and before that he spent 4 years as a political reporter in the Republican Herald in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. He covered state and county government. He holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from Shippensburg University. And did you bring your guitar with you tonight? He has other talents. He has other talents he has not mentioned here. So I will turn this over to Mr. Wolfgang. Please welcome him.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks to the committee, thanks to our great panelists, and all of you for coming out here this evening. I think it's pretty good proof to see all of you out here of the interest in this issue. I write about a lot of different things at the Washington Times, but this is the one topic that consistently gets the most feedback. Anytime the word drone appears in a story, we get a lot of comments, we get a lot of people sharing the story, a lot of tweets, and it's not really much of a surprise. It's a pretty a juicy topic, an interesting one. I've seen some of the technology up close, some of these drones, and it's really quite amazing. You're going to hear a lot more about that tonight, I know, from Carl and others. It's remarkable what these things can do, some of the amazing potential they hold for law enforcement, for first responders. You've already seen, or a lot of us have already seen, what they can do for the military, but it's also a little bit frightening, and I think it's easy to understand why. We're at a time right now when all levels of government, even dedicated public servants like police officers, are sometimes looked at with suspicious eye. And so we're going to delve into tonight how the issue regarding law enforcement use of drones and how that can help make Americans safer, and also some of the challenges and controversies surrounding that. So no matter what your feelings are on this issue, and a lot of people have a lot of very passionate feelings on both sides of the argument, I think one thing we can probably all agree on: this is an issue that needs to be talked about now, and I think it's a good thing that we're having this conversation today in 2013. It's better to have it today than it is to have it in 2014 or 2015. So one thing that's encouraged me as I've covered this industry is there is, to, I think, a large extent, a pretty healthy national debate about this. With a few exceptions, it's largely been a respectful debate. I think it's healthy to get these viewpoints out. You're going to hear a lot of differing viewpoints tonight on a whole host of issues related to this topic. So we're going to make sure that respectful debate continues tonight. When we get to the question and answer session, try and keep your questions brief and in the form of a question, not a declaration or an accusation, please, if you would. And so with that, I think you've heard enough from me. I'm going to introduce our first panelist tonight. Carl G. Schaefer, Jr. has over 30 years of experience in the aerospace, defense, and engineering services industry. He currently serves as the Director of Small UAS Products at Aurora Flight Sciences. Before joining Aurora in 2003, Mr. Schaefer was the President and CEO of FutureLink Incorporated, an engineering consulting firm he founded in 1995. Prior to FutureLink, he worked in Naval Air Systems Command, or NAVAR, as a senior project engineer for several U.S. Navy and U.S. Marine Corps helicopter, fighter, and unmanned systems development and test programs. While at NAVAIR, Mr. Schaefer was awarded the coveted Senator John D.W. Warner Fellowship for Systems Engineering. He holds 3 patents and is the author of nearly 20 technical papers. Mr. Schaefer holds a bachelor's degree in aerospace and ocean engineering and a master's degree in systems engineering, both from Virginia Tech. He's a doctoral candidate and adjunct professor of electrical and computer engineering at George Mason University, and a resident of Lake Ridge, and lived in Prince William County for more than 20 years. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Carl. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Ben. Well, thank you for that very generous introduction. I will say, I'll start out by saying that I want to give you a brief background of Aurora Flight Sciences. Not many people know that we exist in Prince William County. So I'll tell you a little bit about that and a little bit about some of the works we're doing. And I'm not going to call them drones. Drones is a four-letter word. I know it has 6 letters in it, but it's a four-letter word in the industry. Drones, it's a term that was derived for unmanned targets in Vietnam, and it just kind of stuck. And we prefer to call them unmanned air vehicles or UAVs. So if you will allow me, I'll continue to use that term. The Aurora basically designs and develops and produces very innovative air vehicles. We're a supplier to a lot of companies you may have heard of, like Boeing and Northrop Grumman, Sikorsky. So we develop both. We build both unmanned vehicles, and we also build manned vehicles as well. We supply. We're working on a number of different manufacturing programs. We have large development programs right now for some of the primes. And then also we've developed some indigenous UAVs internally. I'll talk about this in a little bit. But we have 4 facilities. The corporate headquarters is in Manassas. We're at the Manassas Regional Airport. That is our corporate headquarters. Engineering staff is there, administrative staff. We have a research and development facility up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We do a lot of work with MIT. Then we have 2 production facilities, one in West Virginia, in Bridgeport, West Virginia, and another in Columbus, Mississippi. And we build both commercial and military aircraft and systems in those plants. We've been in business since 1989. We've built a large number of aircraft. I'm not going to go through them, but you can see the timeline. And I've been involved in many of those, and I'm quite proud of the history at Aurora. We've done a lot of work. We are about 450 people. About 150 of those folks are in Manassas, and the rest are mostly at our 2 manufacturing facilities. We have about 40 people up in our Cambridge facility. Well, of the UAVs that we do develop, they are 3. We develop anything from the 2-pound Skate, it's just a foam airplane. I'll talk about that in a minute because that has the most applicability for law enforcement. The second is Centaur. That's an optionally manned aircraft. It can be both manned or unmanned. And then the third one that you see at the bottom is called Orion, and that is an 11,000-pound aircraft that can fly for 5 days. It can literally circumnavigate the world unrefueled. It is an amazing aircraft, and we're developing that for the Air Force. Now, Skate is something that I'm proud to say that I developed with my team, and it is a 2-pound foam airplane. And it looks like a toy, but it's not. It's actually being used in Afghanistan right now by the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force. But it has very broad applicability, and one of the things that we've been pushing lately is applicability to the law enforcement market. This is what a system typically looks like. 2 foam airplanes, a controller, a radio link, and a very small computer and some wires. And it's very small, very tiny, very easy to operate. You can see in the lower right-hand corner, those are the cameras. And each one of those payload pods, as we call them, has 3 cameras that we can switch. One looks to the side, one looks down, one looks forward. These cameras are very, very small, a little bit bigger than the ones in your cell phone. But a little bit smaller than something you would have, say, in a GoPro Hero, for those of you that are familiar with that. So why small UAS for law enforcement? Well, it's a low-cost and very safe asset for a number of important law enforcement missions, including search and rescue, vehicle accidents, disaster response, barricaded subject events or hostage events, as you might know them, and real-time overwatch of special events or demonstrations. And last week, for instance, a small UAS about the size of Skate, a little bit larger, found an accident victim in Canada. He'd been missing for some time. He suffered severe head trauma, but had migrated or had actually crawled away from the vehicle. They couldn't find him. And actually, one of the small UASs that was operated by the Canadian police found him. And then we also know from talking to the Boston police that when the Boston Marathon bomber, the one that ultimately lived and was located and found later in the boat that he was hiding in, helicopters could not find him the first day that they were searching because they were grounded because of a low ceiling And we know from talking to the folks here that if the skate could have flown in that weather, and we could have probably detected him because we do have some infrared capability, and we might have gotten that person in a day earlier than they had. Finally, this is well, not finally, but this is the Metrolec SWAT team. They've been trained to use skate. They're not flying it right now, but Metrolec is the SWAT team. Metrolec stands for the Metropolitan Law Enforcement Council. They're outside of Boston. It's a council of a lot of local law enforcement agencies, and the SWAT team is basically shared amongst the various communities around Boston. And this is one of the training sessions with them. So we see broad applicability for the various missions for both law enforcement and first responders that I mentioned earlier. But the challenges for law enforcement. Educating a very wary public and lawmakers on the value of using small UAVs for law enforcement and first responder missions. There's a regulatory environment. Many of the law enforcement agencies, all the law enforcement agencies, if they're going to operate this, have to apply to the FAA for what we call a Certificate of Authorization, or a COA, in order to operate. The FAA is trying to streamline that process, but it's very difficult. It takes a long time, anywhere from 45 days to several months, and they're not always guaranteed that they're going to get one. So I believe that public policy is lagging the immediate need. And then also funding sources. How are the local law enforcement and state and federal agencies going to pay for this? Most are funded using grants. Others are funded using asset forfeiture. And then the challenges for us, this is my final slide. We as manufacturers and developers of UASs, or unmanned air vehicles, or UAVs, unmanned aerial systems, I should say, we have to overcome the public perception that, quote unquote, drones are ubiquitous. They're circling all around us. They're watching us. They're not. We're not allowed to. We cannot fly. The FAA disallows us for flying unless you have a COA and you're specifically authorized. They are not flying all over the country. And folks are threatened with respect to encroachment on their privacy, and I can see why. I'm a civilian as well, too. I don't like people watching me. I think we need to do a better job in educating the public and lawmakers on the benefit of using UAVs for the public good. And the FAA is very tightly regulating, as I mentioned this, in the national airspace. The majority of the COAs granted to small U.S. are used for law enforcement research and disaster relief, not for military missions, not for spying on folks. And then a few of the larger assets, typically those that you see in Afghanistan or Iraq, are being flown on the southern border for border protection and border overwatch. We need to work within the FAA regulatory framework because I believe that they're slow to adopt policies. The technology is just far outstripping the policy making in Washington, and that's become a very big headache, actually. And then finally, we need to address the privacy issue head on. I think many of us, even in the UAS industry, share the privacy concern, and I think we need to do a better job of educating the public and to work with folks in the law enforcement, the various advocacy components, agencies and organizations, as well as the FAA and the regulatory agencies, to make sure that we provide a system that meets the framework of all the stakeholders. I can talk later on about Florida versus Riley. I know my time is about up, so I'd be more than happy to talk about that later, but I look forward to your questions in the panel discussion, so thank you very much. I'm sure.
I told them that some of those things are pretty cool. You proved me right, so thank you. Sure. Next up, we're going to have Amy Stepanovich. She's the director. Oh, it's off. Any better? There we go. Oh, a lot better. Okay. Amy is the director of the Electronic Property Information Center Surveillance Project. Her work encompasses the Fourth Amendment, national security, cybersecurity, digital identity, international privacy, and open government. Stepanovich is an expert on drone surveillance and has testified in front of Congress on the need for privacy protections for domestic drone use. She has discussed the privacy implications of surveillance at many prominent events, including the Internet Governance Forum, the General Assembly of the Atlantic Treaty Association, and the Dialogue on Diversity Conference. New York Law School, where she pursued studies on media law, technology, and the First Amendment. She has a Bachelor's of Science degree, magna cum laude, in advertising from the Florida State University. Ms. Stepanovich is Law School Media and Policy Law Journal. She was a law clerk at the Legal Aid America. She's a member of the New York and Washington, D.C. bars and the Federal Communications Bar Association. She's also one of my go-to sources when I write about these things.
So thank you all for being here. As Ben said, my name is Amy Stepanovich. I'm also very short. I'm the director of the Domestic Surveillance Project at the Electronic Privacy Information Center. EPIC is an independent nonprofit research center in Washington, D.C. We were founded in 1994 to focus public attention on emerging issues involving technology and privacy and civil liberties. EPIC first took up the issue of drone surveillance in 2005 in a report where EPIC noted, "The federal government's redirection of military technology toward the civilian population is troubling. The use of drones gives the federal government a new capability to monitor citizens clandestinely." Drones hit the public spotlight again in 2011. Times reported that a drone owned by, licensed to, and operated by the Bureau of Customs and Border Protection, which is a component of the Department of Homeland Security, had lent one of its drones to a police department in a small town in North Dakota in order for the images of a man and his family who were housing rogue cattle had been accused of appropriating the herd. This was the look the public received into the agency's program of allowing other entities to borrow and use its drones on missions that were not related to the agency's own statutory mandate. Since then, EPIC has learned, thanks to documents that we obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, that many of the agency's 10 Predator B drones that they operate in the United States are built with technology that allows them to intercept electronic communications and identify human targets. The issues associated with drones took off in February 2012. That year, in February 2012, Congress passed the FAA's Authorization Act and set in motion a 5-year plan to integrate drones into the national airspace. The FAA has already taken steps toward this integration and is now in the process of identifying 6 nationwide test sites where they will further move toward a country where drones do fly everywhere. The process is focusing on streamlining licenses for commercial and government drones. The FAA explicitly has no jurisdiction over individual non-commercial drone use. Since 2011, I have testified in front of 3 federal congressional committees on the importance of safeguarding privacy against the proliferation of drones. Today, I'm joining this conversation as the token privacy advocate, and that's a role I'm very comfortable with. And I'll start with a confession. I think drones are fascinating. I read the news, and I marvel at the future when drones will change the face of journalism and agriculture. Drones can be used to help monitor for environmental abuse, prevent the spread of forest fires, and assist in search and rescue missions. And most importantly, they will deliver my Mexican takeout right to my door without any tip necessary. But I can keep an entire city under 24/7 visual surveillance. Federal agencies can and stalk their victims. Complained that an unidentified man was using a camera. Soon, a stranger set an airphone into flight. Several minutes, I looked out my 3rd-story window to see a drone hovering a few feet away. My husband went to talk to the man on the sidewalk outside our home who was operating the drone with a remote control to ask him not to fly his drone near our home. The man insisted that it is legal for him to fly an aerial drone over our yard and adjacent to our windows. He noted that the drone has a camera which transmits images he reviewed through a set of glasses. He purported to be doing research. The woman reported that she called the police, but they decided it was unnecessary to come out once the man had left. Drones can be used. And while in this instance the man may have been in violation of trespass laws, other uses of drones by individuals, corporations, or the government fall into legal gray areas. It is in these areas that I, like the rest of the privacy community, see a unique opportunity to protect individual rights against nefarious drone uses, such as we have not had with previous surveillance technologies. So let me say this, drones are only a new platform for surveillance technologies that we already see in the public domain. On their own, many of these tools are already incredibly invasive. Facial recognition tools can identify you based on public. Thermal imaging cameras can see through walls, fences, and other barriers. And store your license plate and by extension your location in a database. And drones are also likely platforms for stingray receptors, which are fake cell phone towers that can locate, interfere with, and intercept communications from cell phones and other wireless devices. And this is just to name a few. These technologies are out there, and the way that we look at them individually should not change just because we put them on a drone. However, if we pretend that drones don't change the surveillance game, we're simply fooling ourselves. There are substantial legal and constitutional issues involved in the deployment technologies together, compounding their standalone capability. Cheap and simple to conduct surveillance over long distances and for long periods of time, such as 5 days. In many cases, by virtue of their size and design, drones can operate in areas that were previously unavailable to surveillance, next to homes or apartment buildings, over fences within enclosed spaces, or patrolling up and down the sidewalks. And we cannot forget that the technology is developing at an exponentially fast rate. As technologist Bruce Schneier said, expensive and rare is tomorrow's commonplace. Currently, no federal law protects against drone surveillance. Drone proponents often point to the Fourth Amendment to quell fears of persistent drone surveillance, though this doesn't apply to private actors, and it is uncertain how the courts will interpret the amendment when confronted with drone surveillance by law enforcement and other state and federal entities. The Supreme Court has previously held that the Fourth Amendment does not protect against aerial surveillance in most instances. Representative Markey and Representatives Poe and Lofgren have introduced 2 bills in the House that would mandate certain civil liberties protections in drone operations. In the Senate, Senator Udall has announced that he will pursue drone legislation, and Senator Leahy announced that U.S. drone surveillance would be one of the Judiciary Committee's priorities this term. In addition to work at the federal level, over 40 states have introduced legislation regarding drone surveillance. 4 states have passed laws: Florida, Idaho, Montana, and Virginia. 2 states have resolutions with legislation pending, both Alaska and Nevada. These state bills have many things in common, though some take different approaches based on their own local concerns. For example, Virginia, not seeking to become one of the 6 test sites, passed a moratorium on how much drone use by state or local government, passed a moratorium on much drone use by state or local government entities. And I'll leave that for Mr. Klein to discuss later. Cities like Seattle have had luck limiting law enforcement use of drones at the local level. After citizen protests stemming from the purchase of drones by the police, the Seattle mayor passed an ordinance that effectively limited the department's use of drones. Last report showed that the city was attempting to find someone to purchase their aircraft. In addition to legislative efforts, progress has been made at the administrative level of government. Epic has requested that the FAA implement basic privacy and transparency requirements into their plan to integrate drones into the national airspace. In comments recently filed with the FAA, as the agency moves forward with their selection of the 6 test sites, Epic asked the FAA to maintain a public database of drone operators, including their geographic area of operation and the surveillance equipment that they'll carry. Epic has also asked the FAA to implement data collection and retention statements to ensure the public notice of domestic drone surveillance operations. EPIC has called on individual federal agencies who operate drones, such as the Bureau of Customs and Border Protection, to implement binding usage regulations, which would include privacy protections. In testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee earlier this year, I issued numerous recommendations for what lawmakers should consider as they look toward drone limitations. Some of the items that EPIC highlighted were warrant requirements for law enforcement, reporting requirements, updates to peeping Tom laws to make sure that your neighbors can't spy into your window, use and data retention limitations, and requirements that would foster transparency and public accountability for drone operators. As surveillance technology continues to leap ahead, we need to be ready with accompanying measures to ensure that individual rights are not eroded. I hope you will join me in a conversation about how to protect privacy and civil liberties in the development of the use of drones throughout the U.S. Thank you.
And do you have to tip a drone that delivers your Mexican food? Or are you all kind of off the hook for that? I guess we'll figure that out. We'll figure that out later on. It's yet to be determined. Thank you very much, Amy. Next speaker is Dana Schrad, who's been the executive director of the Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police since January 1996, where she oversees the development of training programs for police executives and advocates on policing and criminal justice issues on behalf of the association. She was staff attorney for the Virginia State Crime Commission from 1989 until 1996. Where she was in charge of a variety of criminal justice and law enforcement studies. She also ran a drug trafficking study task force for 2 years. She directed a study of drug courts and worked as part of a team to help localities develop drug court programs. She staffed the Commission on Sexual Assault for 2 years, where she participated in the revision of a number of sexual assault and family violence laws and the drafting of Virginia's sex offender registry statute. Prior to entering law school, she worked at a CBS television affiliate for 10 years, where she was a police beat reporter, executive producer, and assignment editor. She's a graduate of the University of Nebraska Journalism School and the University of Richmond Williams School of Law. She's taken several doctoral courses at Virginia Commonwealth University and has taught constitutional law and current criminal justice issues for the Bluefield College Criminal Justice Undergraduate Program. So my fellow journalists, there you go.
Thank you. That is true. I think the journalism profession is a bit of a brotherhood. Once you're in it, you never really leave it, which is kind of surprising that a bunch of police chiefs hired someone who's a journalist and a lawyer to work for them. And you have to be from law enforcement to understand why that's kind of funny. I'm stalling because, let's see, what's the deal on the PowerPoint? You know what? I don't want to hold you up. I'm going to go ahead and get started. My daughter is actually our communications manager at the Chiefs Association. This is what happens when you have an intern who becomes indispensable. And so she ended up getting hired, but she can catch up because she'll figure out where I am in this whole thing. Anyway, I'll just preface this by saying that Delegate Klein worked on this legislation that we had in Virginia, and I'm going to just briefly reference it, and he'll go into detail and talk about how we got what we ended up with in Virginia. But his bill, along with a bill introduced by Delegate Todd Gilbert, were kind of combined, and Delegate Klein took the lead on the bill, but it does, as Amy mentioned, placed a moratorium on the use of drones in Virginia. It's kind of buying some time until we figure out what kind of approach, what kind of policy Virginia wants to adopt. However, we did create some sort of reasonable exceptions in the statute. Delegate Klein was very gracious in understanding that there are areas where unmanned drones used for surveillance help us tremendously in when you have missing children, we have several different alert systems for missing senior citizens, children, etc. And also when you have other kinds of search and rescue operations, and also for training as well. So there's an exception in there for our Guard when they need to do training on drone operation. And the language in there that kind of describes the parameter, the policy parameter, I'm going to talk a lot about policy, is that our language says in there that we can use, the exception for law enforcement is using drones for the purpose of a search or rescue operation where use of an unmanned aircraft system is determined to be necessary to alleviate an immediate danger to any person. So that's a fairly reasonable box to put the use of drones in for law enforcement. It also has, during the moratorium period, some development requirements in there. One is to develop, I was just telling Delegate Klein, I'm not sure what the word protocol means, but we've interpreted it as being it requires us to develop maybe some policy and training pieces for law enforcement on the appropriate use of unmanned drones. The Chiefs Association is going to work with an agency called Department of Criminal Justice Services, DCJS. That's our regulatory and agency that works with law enforcement on developing model policies and training protocols and best practices. There are the larger national organization, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, has developed some model guidelines on the use of drones, unmanned aircraft for surveillance, that basically is something I know that we're going to look at because it was developed sort of as a national model. And actually, a Virginia police chief is part of that committee for the International Association of Chiefs of Police. The Henrico chief, Doug Middleton, is very knowledgeable on this issue, and I'm sure he'll end up getting involved. But once again, when we talk about drones, and for the industry folks, that can be a bit of a loaded word. They know that it has a lot of different meanings to different people. We really are not talking about anything that's weaponized. I mean, that's not something that even Virginia law enforcement discusses using. We're clearly talking about surveillance drones for the purposes of being able to do search and rescue and other kinds of criminal investigative operations that are necessary. So I'm going to talk to you as if I were talking to a bunch of my police chiefs to say, what are we going to do in terms of going forward and identifying what the key issues are around this problem? There you go. See, this is why we hired her. Ta-da! So these are sort of the issues that we end up talking about. In law enforcement, we have to talk about an efficient use of resources, and I'll go into each of these separately. Officer safety is a big concern. Investigation support, you want to use whatever tools you can that improve the quality of investigation. But also recognizing that you have to have reasonable, legitimate use of the technology for law enforcement purposes. So we do try to sort of stay in our lane when we talk about using technology for law enforcement. And then also we are very much concerned about public perception and acceptance when we use new technologies to make sure that it's understood and accepted by the public. So let's talk about each of those. Efficient use of resources. This is my pitch to Delegate Klein. We have decreasing funding support at the federal level, the state level, the local level for law enforcement. This has been a trend for some years now. Back in the 90s, we had a wealth of federal grant funding. We had a wealth of state funding that supported our law enforcement agencies at the state and local level. That has been on the decline for some time. However, inverse to that is you have increased mandates on law enforcement. And those mandates involve things like increased training mandates. They want our folks to have all kinds of specialized training. Training is not free. They want us to have certain kinds of certifications. If you're going to be a specialist in a certain area, they want you to be certified. They want you to be a school resource officer who's gone through specialized training, etc. The list goes on and on. And then we also have in certain areas pro-arrest laws that require law enforcement to be more proactive in certain areas of enforcement. All of these are very resource-driven activities for law enforcement, which means manpower, training, equipment, etc., and that doesn't come free. And then also we realize that in the midst of all this, we have an increasing public safety challenges, whether it's immigration, whether it's just our urbanization of our society, all kinds of things that we deal with. Those increasing challenges make it more difficult to meet citizen expectations and needs without using technology. So these are the ways that we have to look at efficient use of resources and make sure that we communicate all that to all of you in a way that you accept and understand. Officer safety. This is a big concern. Some of you may have asked why I'm wearing a badge with a shroud over it. This is Law Enforcement Officer Memorial Week. We lose a lot of officers every year, many in car accidents, but just as many, if not more, by firearms and other kinds of weapons. So law enforcement officers face increasing risks on the street. People don't respect law enforcement the way they used to. When an officer yells stop, they don't stop anymore. Okay? So it's a much more difficult, demanding, and very high-risk job. Use of surveillance technology puts some distance between the officer and the possible harm. We're able to use different kinds of surveillance technology, for example, for bomb detection. You don't go in and try to pick something up anymore. You have cameras that you can operate, go in. Those are forms of drones that can help you detect a bomb, and you don't put those officers or anybody else in the public in harm's way. Fewer officers being hired means fewer officers to deploy to the scene. And so any other kind of technology you can have out there that puts some eyes on the street, some ears on the street for you in some way, those are assistants to law enforcement to do their job. So that technology does offer those extra eyes that are objective and accurate. And that's the other thing too, is that what you get on a video camera is that accurate depiction of what happened as opposed to an officer's testimony sometime later. And of course they do everything they can to accurately remember what they see at the scene and same thing with witnesses, but when you have video, recordings of something that's happened, then you've got something that is accurate and unbiased. Which leads us to investigation support. What you have from cameras, especially when it produces recordings, is you have accurate, direct evidence that assists in criminal investigations. It's one of the reasons now why many of our cars, our vehicles have cameras in the car, because when you do traffic stops, you got the he said, she said, he said situation. That camera records the incident. It protects not only the officer, it also protects the citizen, because you have an accurate depiction of what occurred. Camera surveillance can be quicker to deploy and access than placing officers at the scene. And I'm sure you've all talked about what happened in Boston. Had there not been cameras on the street, we would not have picked up those folks as quickly as they were picked up in Boston. And I think many of you may have heard their next destination was New York. And then recorded images provide fair and accurate evidence that can be superior in quality to an officer's observations, particularly in low light levels, etc. It's one of the reasons why whenever we develop technology for the military to use, and it's declassified, ITT technology that developed night vision, now that's an important piece of equipment for law enforcement to be able to use in low light situations. Privacy expectations. I'm a lawyer. I understand this issue as well, and as with all issues that affect your constitutional rights, we seek balance. So we look for public understanding of the right to privacy may be different than what the law actually allows. And I think if you get in conversations about what you think privacy means, you'll find that it is different than what the law really is. And so we all have different expectations and understanding of what privacy is. We also discussed the fact that there's a difference between, and Amy mentioned this, warranted versus unwarranted surveillance. And for us in the law enforcement world, that means you've gone and you've gotten a warrant from a magistrate, from a court, in order to utilize the surveillance equipment for whatever the limited purpose is, limited time, etc., as opposed to unwarranted situations. Then you got to recognize that you have public versus private use of this technology. If law enforcement, if the government doesn't use it, that doesn't mean that the private sector is not using it also. We do whatever we can to level the playing field with the criminal element out there, and when they've got tools that are better than law enforcement's, we're in a losing game. And then you have long-term investigations versus emergency response. We had the GPS bill that got passed back in 2012 after a federal court decision that said that if you're going to put GPS equipment on a vehicle to surveil, and you've kept that on that vehicle for some time to collect data on the movement of that vehicle, that is a Fourth Amendment search and seizure issue, and so then you have to get a warrant. And then so it's the long-term investigations issue. And then the next being something on a more practical level, limited reasonable use. We have reasonable, legitimate uses of the technology for law enforcement purposes, but as Carl mentioned, this stuff's not in the sky all the time. It may be going down in price, but we have many, many agencies that are never going to afford this technology, or they're going to be able to afford it in a limited way. It's costly to purchase. It's costly also, though, to use and then to train, and there are limits on being able to do that. And then we have this slow shift from human-based to technology-based evidence collection to follow legislative and judicial policy, which is my way of saying, as we use technology, it changes the way that law enforcement does business, and sometimes that doesn't make people comfortable. And so we have to find that balance between using that technology in the place of an officer versus having that officer there. So that last thing being public perception, which is I think a lot of what we want to talk about here tonight. I want to mention that the ever-changing technology is another thing. It puts a burden on law enforcement to keep the public informed. So as we change our use of technology, it's incumbent that we keep you all informed about what we're using it for, how we're using it, how it benefits you, because we're seeking that balance between protecting your privacy rights, but also providing for your safety. Go to the next slide, Aaron, real quick, because I want to mention I'm alluding to things that are beyond drones. Amy mentioned this because really what we're talking about is a larger area of use of surveillance equipment of different types. So we do have license plate readers. We do have high-resolution video surveillance equipment. And there are some places, and I'll just mention, I don't want to go over too long here, I'll mention the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office has got now what they call an integrated command center, where you can pull all of this together, including acoustic gunshot detection, and be able to monitor an event and catch a criminal very quickly, and I can describe that a little bit later if you're interested. So my time's up, but I just want to mention that we are very aware of the concerns of our general public, and we want to make sure that our citizens are comfortable with what we're doing, and obviously we follow what the confines of the law are in law enforcement when it comes to the use of any kind of technology. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dana. Last up tonight, we have Ben Klein, represents the 24th Legislative District in the Virginia House of Delegates, including Lexington, Bath, and Rockbridge counties, portions of Amherst and Augusta counties. He was elected to the House in a special election in 2002 and re-elected to his sixth term in November 2011. Delegate Klein chairs the House Conservative Caucus, and he also serves on the House Finance Committee, the Commerce and Labor Committee, the Courts of Justice Committee, and the Committee on Militia, Police, and Public Safety. He was the patron of HB 2012, which Dana was just referring to, was signed into law in April as the first statewide limitation on the use of unmanned aircraft or drones in the nation. Ben is currently an assistant Commonwealth's attorney for Rockingham County and the city of Harrisonburg. From 1994 to 2002, Delegate Klein worked for Congressman Bob Goodlatte, beginning as a policy advisor and ultimately serving as the Congressman's chief of staff. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Bates College and his law degree from the University of Richmond. Delegate Klein and his wife Elizabeth live in Rockbridge County with their two daughters. Ben?
Well, good evening. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's great to be up in Prince William County. At the invitation of this interestingly named group. I hadn't heard of the group of 100, and I was very intrigued by it. My good friend Delegate Anderson, Rich Anderson, invited me to come learn more and join in on this panel, and I'm glad to be here. It's true I authored the moratorium on drones, but when the session started this year, that was not my intent. My hope was at the time that some kind of compromise could be found between the drone industry, between law enforcement, between privacy advocates, civil libertarians, the Tea Party. All of these different groups were very interested in drones, and I think part of it was the FAA indicating that they were going to promulgate regulations on the use over a 5-year period in 2012, and that got a lot of people talking, a lot of people thinking about it. Legislation was introduced, and a committee considered it, but negotiations did not prove to be successful. And at that point, I introduced the legislation as kind of a marker to hold things in place while we continue to negotiate, and hopefully we can come to some agreement over the next 2 years, if necessary, hopefully sooner, over what and how can be used for unmanned aerial surveillance. My constituents use the word drones, so I use the word drones. But I think, if you, to answer the question, if you don't tip for your Mexican, the drone just deploys toilet paper and just runs around your tree as many times as it can. No, I'm kidding. But they are fascinating, and tonight we're only looking at a very slim subset, well, half of the potential use of drones. We're not looking at private sector use. Those uses are infinite, and people were talking before and at dinner about someone who used a drone to help walk his daughter to school in the morning. Another use I heard during the session was, you can't make your kid's soccer game, pay a drone company, they'll hover over the field, watch the kids play soccer, and then send you the videotape. You can only make up so many, an unlimited number of potential uses in your mind for the private use of this type of technology. Some of it good, some of it bad. Like all inanimate objects, some things can be, it can be used for good. It can be used for bad. Cars can be used for good things, can be used for bad things. Guns can be used for good things, can be used for bad things. The person behind the use is what's important, and how they use it is important. But we are looking at law enforcement use. As someone who works with law enforcement every day as an assistant prosecutor, I know that law enforcement acts with the civil liberties of the citizens in mind and works to protect those and respects the Fourth Amendment, and would seek to operate within those limitations put in place by the courts. But with new technologies come new challenges, and so what was a standard put in place by the courts in the 1980s dealing with aerial surveillance, which was a plain view standard, essentially if you are going to be operating, you do not need a warrant to operate and surveil things that are in plain view. So if someone is growing marijuana in their garden, in the backyard, and you're looking down from a helicopter, you do not need a warrant for that surveillance. But drones can see this piece of paper, read it from 30,000 feet, and circle 24/7. You have to have more than one to go longer than a couple of days, but the point is made that this is a different level of surveillance. This is a different challenge to the Fourth Amendment. And the rules need to reflect modern technology. So I think there is a consensus among most in the General Assembly that as warrants are required for GPS use, when you're going to stick some kind of GPS surveillance device under a bumper for long-term surveillance of where a car goes for a drug deal or something like that, a similar point is in place for long-term surveillance through the use of a drone. The warrant should be required for that type of long-term surveillance, especially if there aren't exigent circumstances and there isn't an addressed immediate threat to life or limb on a large scale, whether it be something like the Boston Marathon situation or some kind of natural disaster. And to that end, those types of situations need to be thought of as permanent policies are put in place. As we move forward with the legislation, it started out as a clean moratorium. The point was made in the House that there are those kinds of situations where a child is missing, so we put in an exception for an Amber Alert. When a senior is missing, so we included senior alerts, and when a law enforcement officer is in immediate danger, so we have what are called blue alerts, which are already in place and in the code. So we had those three code sections included in the moratorium. When the bill was combined in the Senate, we made a reference in there to ensure that for ongoing search and rescue of a specific individual, that was going to be permitted under the moratorium, and that when our National Guard in Virginia works with the federal government through, and they use those types of technologies through their training in Virginia, our National Guard can still work with our armed forces as they use those types of technologies in their training. So the bill was sent to the governor, who had said on a radio program not a few weeks earlier that he thought that the use of drones by law enforcement was great and that there should not be any legislation to limit that at this point. So we had an uphill challenge when we presented the bill to the governor. But through a lot of conversations with my friends at this table and with others, we were able to work with the governor's office. He sent down amendments to clarify that training, the use of these types of technologies for training exercises should also be included. He expanded the search and rescue language slightly to, as was explained, address an immediate threat to someone's life. There was an incident in Appomattox County where a person on the run was cornered by a helicopter, and the gentleman responded by shooting at the helicopter. If there's an opportunity to preserve law enforcement lives, men and women who are seeking to keep us safe, we should make sure that we make all efforts to do that, to protect their lives. So we did expand that language slightly. Then we also did not want to exclude Virginia as a potential site for one of the 6 test sites for the FAA. So we made sure that training and research and development through cooperation with research institutions like Virginia Tech was not banned under the moratorium. So on campuses doing research with this type of technology, that was also included in the bill. The governor wanted the Department of Criminal Justice Services to develop model protocols. I don't know what those are either. The governor is obviously wanting law enforcement agencies to come up with some proposals over the next 6 months. I'm hopeful that they can come up with some ideas that will lead us to a potential agreement, maybe as soon as 2014 session in January. But there are several law enforcement agencies who would prefer that the status quo be kept in place, which is essentially no limitation other than that which the Constitution provides through the Fourth Amendment and through the courts. So we're hopeful that we can eventually reach an agreement either through regulations or through legislation, and that we can continue to maintain an appropriate balance between protection of civil liberties and law enforcement needs going forward into the future. It's a brave new world, but I am hopeful that this type of activity will stoke some discussion and some solutions from you all, the public, as well as from our panelists. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, we're ready.
All right, we're good to go. Tape is rolling. So if you guys, whoever has a question, I'll just open it up to you guys. Gentleman right here.
You know the routine. State your name and your district.
Harry Wiggins, Occoquan Magisterial District. Why should we trust the government?
It's a great question.
Clancy, do you have a question?
Oh, is that not a question?
Oh,
I'll answer
oh,
it.
I thought nobody was
The
wanting
government
to
will
answer
answer.
that one. All right.
Don't trust the government. That's my answer. That's why the Fourth Amendment is in place, to make sure that your right against unreasonable search and seizure is protected. Now, making sure that that's applied to the 21st century and the technologies that are out there appropriately is good. And so that's what we're trying to do here. Make sure that the Fourth Amendment is kept current and applicable in the 21st century.
Can I follow on with that real quick?
Certainly.
I think one of the things, and I've spoken to many different law enforcement officers, is that they really want to use this technology for good purposes. However, where Epic is coming from is that we've seen technology that can be used for good purposes abused. And I think there was a reference earlier, at least an allusion to a Supreme Court case, United States versus Jones, that was decided in January 2012. That case involved law enforcement's argument that they could put a GPS device on your car without a warrant and track you for 30 days, your location 24 hours a day. And the court said that is unconstitutional under the Fourth Amendment. It took that court decision for police to understand that they could not do that. And with drones, we have kind of the opportunity, as was mentioned after the Supreme Court case, there was a law passed. Now we have the opportunity to pass the law at the beginning and put the protections in place before the abuses occur. And I think that's really key here, and it's something that we don't get with many of the surveillance technologies that are in use.
Yeah, I'm Clancy McQuaig from Occoquan. I'm a retired firefighter, and I got a question for Carl primarily, but any one of you geniuses that are with him can address it if you will. I've been working with UAV since 1967, so I've got a little experience under the dam. The number one killer of firefighters is searching empty buildings or firefighters getting lost in buildings. And we need to be able to get some one of these UAVs up over the building that can actually tell whether there's a person either lost or needing rescue, or there's no one in the building, so they don't have to enter the building. And I don't know whether Carl can come up with a solution like that. These little handheld ones is great. The chief shows up on the scene, throws it in the air, and it goes up and it looks in the building and says, yeah, we got 2 kids and a dog. Or it goes up and looks around and says, there's nobody in there, stay out. There's no reason to put live people into a burning building unless you got a hose line with you. Can you do that sort of thing?
Sure. In fact, we were in discussions with the Seattle Fire Department because they had very similar issues and concerns. And one of the things that we were talking about developing for them was a tethered, what we would call a quad rotor, to carry a camera, an infrared camera, up in this downtown area with a lot of skyscrapers to see where their hot spots are, and so that they could better direct their resources. And yes, we have that technology and we can do that, and it's just a question of getting it out there and, to the first responders.
I think that any permanent policy put in place would allow for some kind of situation that you describe involving a fire and someone in danger.
My only question, I'm Harry Glasgow from Coles District. My only question is, how much does this stuff cost?
Well, it depends on what you're buying. The skate system that we would sell for law enforcement is about $35,000 for the system and spares. It's very expensive. It has a lot of capability, but one of the things I'm concerned about as a UAV supplier is that because of the bans that are the moratoriums that are being put in place, for instance, in Virginia, a lot of the law enforcement, well, I won't say law, I am aware of several law enforcement agencies that are going to places like Brookstone and buying the AR Parrot, which is a quad rotor with a camera, and it can be flown with your iPad or your iPhone, and they are using that. They're getting around, they're skirting this so that they can locate barricaded subjects and support accident investigations. I know of 2 sheriff's departments in Arkansas that are doing that. So the technology is there. There are inexpensive ways to do this, but our system is it can be purchased through grants and through some other means, asset forfeiture, for instance.
And no matter how expensive they are a very small amount compared to helicopters and other aerial surveillance. Both maintenance and purchase price is much lower.
Brian Moriarty. I'm here with Westminster, and I'd like to ask you about the fact they've showed it on TV. The small drones that evidently are made, even that kids can use them, exist right now. My understanding is you can get them in the appropriate store, and those being used, we really have people using drones, which we have to recognize. I hope that they're told in some way about the current moratorium and what the regulations are so that no incident would be occurring. Is there any type of announcements, public relations, information being sent out for people to know about this?
And one thing we were clear on is that the commercial application privately of this type of technology, we didn't see a need to limit that at this point. There are laws in place for peeping Tom laws and things like that, where abuse of those types of technologies by a private citizen would be enforceable under current laws, criminal laws. But just the use of the technology by private individuals the government should not be limiting that type of commercial technology. It should be encouraged, and in fact, Virginia should be a center for innovation when it comes to development of that type of technology. There are a lot of jobs, a lot of great potentials for that. It's when government is using that type of technology that government needs to be limited. That's the whole purpose of the Fourth Amendment, and that's the whole purpose of the moratorium.
Amy mentioned something about the GPS bill that was passed last year after the U.S. versus Jones case was decided by the Supreme Court, and that dealt with, she mentioned something about, law enforcement using GPS tracking until that decision was adopted by the court. Keep in mind that private investigators still do that. They have not been limited in any way. So if you hire a PI to chase your philandering spouse, they may in fact do that, especially if it's a jointly owned vehicle and you give them permission to put, GPS monitoring under your husband or wife's vehicle. They can do that in a private investigation. So we really are talking about limiting the government versus limiting the use in the private sector. And that private sector also includes criminals, which is our concern.
Carol Nagel. I live in the Gainesville district, and I just wondered if you could give us maybe 4 or 5 specific things that would be the parameters that would make you comfortable with removing the moratorium.
Well, I'm not going to speak for the coalition that's working right now to come up with a consensus, but if government is going to use this type of technology to surveil beyond the current court limits that are in place, i.e. line of sight, what's in plain view, use of infrared. They're going to hover over your house and see through your roof using infrared, then they ought to have to get a warrant. If they are going to use something other than reasonably some type of visual aid, some kind of telescoping technology that's going to allow them to see from 30,000 feet through to the very small amounts. Perhaps a warrant should be required at that point. If they're going to be up longer than 24 hours, maybe a warrant is required, or a certain amount of time. The GPS decision was a good kind of roadmap. The problem is with the GPS decision, when the court struck down the use of that technology, law enforcement was stuck. They had trouble surveilling potential criminals for a long period of time. They needed to put something in place fast, so they were at our door immediately. We need to pass a law to let us use this quickly. We're in the inverse in this situation, where law enforcement's free to use it until the courts say they can't. Right now, we're the ones knocking, the privacy rights advocates are the ones knocking at the door saying, we need a law. And It's a different scenario down in Richmond right now, and we're trying to work cooperatively. So hopefully we'll get there.
Hi, I'm Brianna Altman. I live in the Occoquan district. My question is relating to the technology. How small can these go? I mean, I've heard they could be as small as a mosquito and get a DNA sample from somebody that's suspected to be a criminal. I mean, you can't believe what you read on the internet, so I'm glad you're here today.
Well, that's a great question. In fact, they are getting very small. In fact, some of them are commercially available for you to fly. I mean, you can certainly find some small helicopters, toy helicopters that you can fly with an iPhone or iPad that fits in the palm of your hand. One of the smallest UAVs that was developed, unfortunately, was developed by one of our competitors, AeroVironment, and it's a hummingbird. I mean, it's a model hummingbird, but they have their limits. It only flies for just a few minutes or a few seconds before it drains its power, and it's more of a novelty than anything of use. Yeah, I mean, everything that the folks that are talking about developing insect-like UAVs, they're still in the lab. They're not commercially available, and they're not very useful, frankly.
And I will once again point out that everything Carl said is totally true. But we don't want to look at the technology as it is today. We want to look at the technology and what it's going to be, because if you legislate for today, then you're ignoring tomorrow. And as I said during my talk, we have said that what is expensive and in the lab and hard to get to today, we're going to have access to. It's going to be cheap. I remember when VCRs and DVD players were outrageously expensive. If you look at how much technology evolves, it's quick.
Scott Bellin from the Neabsco District. I guess this is for Dana, partially, and maybe Delegate Klein. The difference between, obviously, the unwarranted and warranted use of these. Warranted, you've made a reasonable case for it, and the courts have approved it. But the unwarranted video, how long do you think is a reasonable amount of time to keep that before you destroy it? Cameras, I mean, you only have to look at the amount of data that Google can keep, or if you read the stories about NSA data centers they're building out in, I think, Utah. They can keep everything ever at the rate that they're going with the money that they spend on that stuff. What's a reasonable amount of time, or are you just going to have people sitting back and 3 months from now charge somebody with speeding because you caught them on cameras later on, or things like that? When does probable cause, I guess, for, and Delegate Klein, you said potential criminals, it should be suspected criminals, which they can get warrants for to put GPS on the device. But what's a reasonable amount of time that you would store this data, especially when it comes for law enforcement uses, agricultural statistics, fires, disasters, that type of thing? I don't have a problem with, but particularly the law enforcement storage and security of the data.
That's a really good question. I didn't really mention it earlier, but that is a question that we struggle with. But this is not the first time we've dealt with how long do you keep data. We have this on all kinds of evidence that's kept. And I won't ask for a show of hands, but I can tell you that if you've ever been a crime victim, your attitude about how long law enforcement should keep data may be very different. So I'll just use as an example. Let's say for example, we've had video that we've kept from in-car cameras. How long do you keep that? What if you decide that a reasonable length of time is 30 days because 95% of the stops you make aren't going to result in any kind of further investigations? 99% may not. But of that 1%, now after 30 days you've gotten rid of the video. And you find out later that there's some video of a stop you made that may have connected you to, say, oh, I don't know, the Oklahoma City bomber, who Timothy McVeigh, as you know, was found on a traffic stop. It's reasonableness and it is a very difficult thing to determine. I mean, we're going to have to set reasonable limits, but accept the fact that if that's the case, we are going to end up throwing out evidence that later on we're going to wish we had. But the balance is it will throw out a lot of evidence of people who we don't need to keep that data on. But that is always the risk.
I'm really impressed by your presentation. and knowledge. My next-door neighbor, before I moved to this place, worked for Homeland Security, and he talked to us about the cartels in Mexico using these unmanned vehicles. They had subs and the unmanned vehicles to do drops in the United States. It seems to me, tying this further with the immigration issues, with crime, and also the good factors of using this, that when you go in to ask for money, that the value is outweighing the negativity. The cost value that you get back from using these would outweigh, I'm not phrasing it right, but you know where I'm going.
A few things. First of all, in what the government defines as a border area, we all have lower constitutional rights. They're able to conduct greater amounts of surveillance and collect more data in those areas. The government currently defines the border area as 100 miles from any land or sea boundary of the United States. That area encompasses 2/3 of the United States population. It's humongous. In the immigration bill right now that's in the Senate, there's a provision that requires drone surveillance along the southwest border within that 100-mile area, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, constantly. Anybody who is within 100 miles of the southwest border is subject to very intensive drone surveillance. These are the drones that I referred to that not only have the ability to identify human targets, but also intercept electronic communications. When I say electronic communications, it's basically anything that comes or goes from your cell phone. We think that that's too much data. There was a amendment that just passed out of committee yesterday, introduced by Senator Feinstein, that would reduce the 100-mile range to only 25 miles. That would be a great deal of improvement. We're not saying that we don't need surveillance on the border, but that it needs to be targeted toward the border and toward illegal activity and not necessarily as expansive as it is. And one more thing I did allude during my presentation. Customs and Border Protection, the drones that they purchase, they have 10 Predator B drones, they're not only restricted to the border for their use. There is a 2011 report from the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security that shows that Customs and Border Protection has agreements with several local law enforcement agencies across the country, the FBI, the Census Bureau, and other federal agencies to lend their drones out so that other entities can conduct surveillance. So here in Virginia, you could be subject to Customs and Border Protection drone surveillance, even though you aren't necessarily within 100 miles of the border. So you have, first of all, the 100 miles, 2/3 of the population, and then the rest of the population gets roped in. They are cheaper. With cheaper surveillance technologies, you do get more surveillance, which means that you're saving money, but more information is being collected. Like I said, we're all for them being used on the border to surveil the border, but we want to make sure that the policies are in place to provide protection so they're not surveilling and collecting information on everybody.
Are we out of questions, folks? I'm going to give the microphone back to our moderator. Denny, do you have one?
Well, Dana had offered to discuss a Los Angeles project that's
As I recall, there was something called acoustic gunfire
Just to give you an idea, any
detection.
fans of NCIS and CSI out there, okay, in an hour's time, you see complex crimes, right, solved by the use of all that technology. I'll just tell you real quick what the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office is using. They have what they call a kind of a strategic command center now that they do, bringing together different types of technology. And so here's a scenario. Imagine that a shooting has just occurred where the victim is injured or killed. Sensors can immediately detect the gunshot, and they can distinguish between a gunshot and, say, a backfire on a car, and automatically pinpoint high-powered night vision capable cameras on the crime scene and send a live image of the fleeing suspect vehicle to the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department Station Command Center. The license plate is recorded by the camera and then entered into a database. The suspect vehicle drives through an intersection equipped with surveillance cameras that automatically detect the suspect vehicle and alert the command center and nearby sheriff's department vehicles. Live images of the fleeing vehicle are transmitted to the sheriff's vehicles, which then go into pursuit. During the pursuit, the command center takes control of the local traffic signals, turning them red in order to reduce the potential for collisions involving innocent drivers. That's how they utilize a wide variety of different types of sensing, surveillance type of equipment. This is the future of how we use technology. Some of that, for those of you who feel better protected by having that, if you're the person who is held hostage in the fleeing vehicle, or it's your child or whatever, you're all for that. If you're otherwise afraid of this use by the government, you're going to see this, in a very negative way. That's why this is a polarizing issue. It kind of depends on what your personal experience is and whether or not you've ever been a crime victim, ever needed this kind of assistance, ever had any kind of experience like this. So that's why this is such an interesting debate, I think, for all of us.
Second question, Clancy? Is it a short one?
What do we have to do to keep this out of the hands of the IRS? The epic they're abusing every other opportunity they have to surveil us.
Not to call out any federal agency, because I have had interactions this week with more than one federal agency who has been incredibly abusive of privacy rights across the country. We have said that if federal agencies are going to use drones, they have to go to the public, get public feedback on what their policies should be, implement that public feedback, and have public policies that they are then held accountable to by the public to comply with. And that is for any federal agency that operates a drone, and we have said this on numerous occasions. And I think that holds true for your question.
All right, well, if there's no other questions, thanks to our four panelists, thanks to the committee for hosting this event. You guys got a good primer course tonight on law enforcement use of drones, and you should be glad you did, because this is something that's only going to become a hotter issue as we move forward from here. So thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks to our panel once again.